The fluorescent hum of the Mariposa military base underground laboratory was a constant, irritating counterpoint to the desperate silence of pre-war America. Above ground, the relentless anxiety of nuclear brinkmanship permeated every broadcast and political maneuver. Outside, the world was fracturing under resource scarcity and escalating geopolitical tension. Inside, the United States government funded the ultimate biological solution, the forced evolutionary virus. Dr. Richard Gray, still retaining a sliver of the ethical restraint he had possessed when the project began, monitored the readout displays, the green lines indicating cellular activity spiking wildly in chamber Delta 5. His team, sleepless and fueled by military-grade amphetamines, watched the containment glass with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The initial mandate had been simple: create immunity. Design a bioweapon countermeasure capable of inducing hyperregeneration and somatic resilience in American troops, rendering them impervious to the Red Chinese chemical arsenal. But the mandate had metastasized, driven by General Harper's insatiable desire for biological superiority. Immunity was no longer enough. They needed strength, size, and absolute obedience. They needed something more. The early strains of FEV were catastrophic failures, designated FEV-001 through FEV-010. These attempts resulted in rapid terminal necrosis, the subjects dissolving into pools of sloughing tissue and uncontrolled malignancy within hours. The ethical boundary had not been crossed so much as it had been obliterated by the sheer volume of human material sacrificed. The moral cost was measured not in lives, but in wasted resources and failed data. Prisoners, undocumented migrants, and even captured enemy combatants were funneled into the facility's deep testing bunkers. The air in the observation deck, despite the advanced filtration systems, carried a faint, persistent tang of formaldehyde and burnt protein, a smell that had become the scent of progress, a sickening perfume of necessary cruelty. Strain FEV-011 was different. It didn't kill instantly. Gray's breakthrough involved a complex retroviral vector that successfully bypassed the subject's innate immune response while simultaneously forcing the pituitary gland into overdrive. The subject in Delta 5, designated Testa, was a former prison inmate, heavily sedated but still capable of registering the searing systemic pain. The injection site, a thick-gauge needle inserted directly into the carotid artery, began to swell immediately. The subject's muscles seized, pulling taut against the steel examination table. The first audible sign of the transformation was a wet, tearing sound, like heavy fabric ripping under immense tension. The subject's skin, initially pale and clammy, flushed a violent mottled crimson. On the monitor, the cellular division rate reached an exponential curve hypermitosis, occurring at a speed never before recorded in a mammalian system. The subject began to spasm violently against the heavy restraints, the metal cuffs digging deep into the wrists. Then came the sound of bone, not snapping, but growing, expanding, fusing. The clavicles thickened, pushing the shoulders outward, and the rib cage expanded, straining the dermis to the point of rupture. A fine mist of sweat and vaporized blood coated the inside of the chamber glass. Dr. Gray leaned closer to the glass, his face reflecting the harsh white light of the chamber. He saw the subject's face contort, the features blurring as the soft tissue rearranged itself. The brow ridge surged forward, creating a heavy, protective shelf of cartilage and bone. Gray felt a cold, professional detachment, warring with a deep, paralyzing horror. The subject's vocalizations shifted from human screams of pain to guttural, roaring efforts to draw air into their rapidly expanding lungs. Within 40 minutes, the transformation stabilized. The subject, now 3 feet taller and twice as wide as his original frame, tore through the thick leather restraints designed to hold a rhinoceros. His skin was now a sickly, pale green, thick and rubbery, capable of deflecting low-velocity impacts. The eyes, sunken beneath the massive brow, retained a flicker of terrified intelligence, but the hypothalamic restructuring had been too profound. The complex emotional centers were suppressed, replaced by a primal, overriding aggression. The creature's breathing was a loud, rattling sound like tearing iron. The creature for it was no longer a man, slammed its massive fist against the reinforced glass. The impact resonated through the entire facility, rattling the sensitive diagnostic equipment. Gray watched the glass hold, but he knew the containment was only temporary. This new force tested the limits of their engineering. They had engineered resilience, but they had also engineered a monster driven by pure, unadulterated rage. The virus had succeeded beyond their wildest, most terrifying expectations. It had created a being capable of surviving the apocalypse, but at the cost of its own humanity. A first supermutant stood panting in the sterile chamber, smelling faintly of ozone and pulverized muscle fiber, and the research team knew the ethical failure they had committed was now irreversible, a biological plague unleashed upon the pre-apocalyptic world. The creature, no longer a man, slammed its massive fist against the reinforced glass. The impact resonated through the entire subterranean facility, rattling the sensitive diagnostic equipment and sending a shiver through the bedrock that housed the complex. This was not just a physical blow. It was a psychological assault on the illusion of safety that the engineers had spent 2 decades meticulously constructing. The glass, a trilaminate ceramic polymer designed to absorb kinetic energy equivalent to a direct artillery hit, held firm, but the flex indices reported terrifying spikes. Gray watched the glass hold, but he knew the containment was only temporary, a fleeting delay before the inevitable. This new, raw, biological force tested the limits of their engineering far beyond any theoretical stress test involving conventional weaponry. A facility designed to withstand a thermonuclear strike and isolate its inhabitants from the resulting fallout, now faced a war waged within its own meticulously sterilized walls. They had engineered resilience into the structure, but they had also, through deliberate genetic manipulation, engineered a monster driven by pure, unadulterated rage. The forced evolutionary virus had succeeded beyond their most terrifying expectations, creating a being capable of surviving the apocalypse at the cost of its own humanity and sanity. The first supermutant, designated P001, stood panting heavily in the sterile chamber, its immense chest heaving, and the research team knew with sickening certainty that the ethical failure they had committed was now irreversible. A biological plague unleashed not by accident, but by cold, calculated necessity. The atmosphere in the observation deck was thick with a palpable, corrosive fear. Technicians huddled over consoles, their faces illuminated by the frantic red and green readouts of system integrity checks and biohazard alerts. The redundant air conditioning units strained, groaning under the impossible load, trying desperately to compensate for the massive thermal output of the stabilized subject, a creature that maintained a core temperature several degrees above the norm, radiating heat equivalent to a small, inefficient reactor core. The scent of ozone and burnt wiring mixed with the metallic tang of human anxiety. Dr. Gray ignored the frantic alerts, his focus absolute, solely fixed on the creature's eyes. These eyes were the last bastion of the original host, flickering deep within the sockets with a terrifying trapped awareness. A brief spark of sapience fighting a losing battle against the viral takeover. The forced evolutionary virus, FEVE, had achieved stabilization, locking the cellular structure in a state of high-energy maintenance that was fundamentally unsustainable in the long term. The creature's skin, now a thick rubbery sheath of pale green, was fundamentally restructured, possessing an almost geological density that granted near-ballistic resistance, a biological armor vital for surviving the irradiated wasteland, but one that drastically dulled the creature's peripheral senses. This sensory blockade compounded the creature's internal suffering, a constant, agonizing feedback loop of metabolic waste products creating systemic acidosis and persistent, deep internal inflammation. Every movement, every breath, was a reminder of the biological debt it was incurring. Gray noted the creature's breathing pattern, erratic, punctuated by deep, rattling inhalations that sounded less like respiration and more like grinding rust within a collapsing mechanism. The lungs had expanded grotesquely to accommodate the massive oxygen demand of the hypertrophied musculature, creating the characteristic labored respiration that signaled chronic systemic stress. The heart, visible on the fluoroscopic screen as a massive straining pump, circulated a blood volume nearly 4 times the original host's capacity, requiring phenomenal vascular pressure. This biological overdrive was the source of the creature's chronic internal suffering, a systemic, dull ache that the transformed, simplified nervous system could only translate into one universal response: aggression. The sheer volume of blood and the constant cellular repair necessitated an immediate and constant caloric intake, explaining the creature's predatory, obsessive focus on energy acquisition. Gray mentally confirmed that P001 would require massive, sustained feeding to maintain its current physical state, making it not only a formidable military asset, but also an ecological disaster destined to strip any environment bare. The subject began to move with a sluggish, terrifying deliberation, its movements heavy and weighted. It dragged its massive hand across the reinforced glass, the sound a harsh grating scrape, like stone on stone, a sound that seemed to chew at the facility's foundations. Gray activated the audio feed, listening intently. The creature was attempting to speak. The sounds were gravelly, deep rumblings, entirely lacking the necessary vocal cord modulation for human speech. It was a catastrophic failure of the FEV's neural integration. The complex linguistic centers of the brain, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, had suffered catastrophic atrophy during the rapid cranial expansion. The vocalization attempt was a profound tragedy, a final desperate echo of the man trapped inside the biological prison, a sound of pure, frustrated agony and loss. The sounds collapsed into a low-frequency roar of pure animalistic frustration. Data log, entry 74 alpha, Gray dictated calmly, his voice steady against the rising chaos. P001 exhibits profound aphasia, likely due to massive neurological damage secondary to rapid cranial expansion and subsequent pressure necrosis in the temporal and frontal lobes. Linguistic function is permanently suppressed. Aggression quotient remains critically high, correlating directly with the observed hypertrophy of the amygdala and the complete, deliberate suppression of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and moral reasoning. The creature paused its guttural attempts, seemingly listening to the sharp, clinical cadence of Gray's voice, a flicker of environmental processing before the blinding, consuming rage reasserted its dominance. The neurological changes were, for Gray, the most disturbing and yet the most necessary aspect of the transformation. The FEV had prioritized survival instincts over sapience, achieving its mandate with brutal efficiency. The complex architecture of the human brain had been crudely reorganized into a survival machine, optimized for immediate threat assessment and physical response. The hippocampus, the seat of memory and learning, was visibly shrunken and scarred, explaining the creature's inability to recall its past life beyond primal. Fragmented imagery flashes of pain, hunger, and betrayal. The rage was not psychological. It was a hardwired biological imperative, a chemical mandate driven by constant pain. The enhanced motor cortex, however, remained acutely functional, allowing for precise, if brutal, control over the immense new musculature, turning the subject into a living, breathing siege engine designed only for destruction and survival. P001 suddenly ceased its attempts at communication and focused its entire, simplified attention on the heavy steel door of the containment unit. It lowered its immense head, aligning its shoulder to the target, and charged. The impact was deafening, A sickening, low-frequency thud that vibrated through the floor plates and up the spine of every observer. Emergency lights flashed red, bathing the observation deck in a pulsing crimson glow. The door buckled inward slightly, the sound of shearing bolts audible even over the facility's internal noise. "Structural integrity holding at 85%, reported Dr. Olson, his voice thin and cracking with barely contained panic. "Gray, the pressure gauges are spiking across the board. We need to sedate him now, or we risk a catastrophic breach." "Negative." "Olson," Gray countered immediately, his eyes narrowed, his posture rigid with clinical anticipation. "We need to log its maximum output capacity. We are testing the limits of the new evolutionary vector in real time. If it can breach this containment, it means the FEV is even more effective than calculated. It validates the entire project. Prepare the sonic emitters, but do not activate them unless the integrity drops below 70%. We must have the empirical data." Gray's clinical detachment was absolute, viewing the imminent breach not as a threat to his life, but as definitive validation of his theoretical models regarding accelerated evolution under duress. P001 retreated 3 heavy, dragging steps and charged again, this time targeting the hydraulic locking mechanism housing, exhibiting a terrifying, nascent tactical awareness. The second impact was sharper, more focused, and infinitely more destructive. A fine spray of highly pressurized hydraulic fluid misted out from the compromised seal, instantly vaporizing upon contact with the creature's hot skin. The structural compromise was visible even to the naked eye. The observation deck floor vibrated with a terrifying resonant frequency that threatened to shatter the consoles. The creature was learning its own strength and the weaknesses of its prison with frightening speed. The faint, clean smell of ozone that usually permeated the high-tech facility had been replaced entirely by the musky, metallic stench of the creature's high metabolic output, a biological musk that signaled constant, high-level energy expenditure and slow, systemic self-poisoning. The FEV created resilience, but not immortality. It merely shifted the decay mechanism from external threats to internal consumption. P001 was a biological supernova, brilliant and powerful, but destined for a rapid, explosive collapse if not managed perfectly. It was the epitome of engineered desperation. Gray leaned back slightly, allowing himself a moment of grim intellectual satisfaction. The subject's suffering was merely noise, a necessary byproduct of successful engineering. The ethical lines had been crossed long ago, years before the creature was even conceived, when they chose to pursue the FEV as the only viable solution to the looming nuclear winter. Humanity, in its frail, soft, ethically burdened form, was obsolete. The supermutant was the necessary successor, a brutal, optimized organism designed to survive the harsh radiation, the resource scarcity, and the biological warfare that was surely coming. P001 was the prototype for a new species, born of scientific hubris and existential dread, a testament to the fact that survival, when stripped of morality, is an ugly, powerful thing. The creature charged a third time. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound of pure agony. The door frame warped visibly, and the heavy locking bars groaned, inches from catastrophic failure. The containment unit was failing rapidly. Gray gave the order, his voice cutting through the alarms. Activate the sonic destruction array. Set frequency to 15 kilohertz, maximum amplitude. We need to stabilize the subject for immediate transport to the deeper isolation cells. Prepare the FEV strain for mass replication. We have sufficient data. The process is viable for wide-scale application and deployment. As the high-pitched, agonizing sound designed to exploit the creature's slightly enhanced auditory sensitivity filled the chamber, causing P001 to clutch its massive, malformed head and roar in overwhelming pain, Gray watched the screens with dispassionate intensity. The cellular division rate, though stabilized, showed a persistent, low-level error in genetic transcription, a minor, chronic instability that would eventually lead to varying degrees of intelligence degradation and physical mutation across future generations. This was the unavoidable imperfection inherent in their rushed, desperate evolution. But it was a flaw they could live with. The primary goal of physical survival had been achieved. They had created a survival mechanism, and now they had to weaponize it and disseminate it before the bombs fell, sealing the fate of the world with a biological catastrophe far more complex and enduring than mere nuclear fire. The creation shuddering under the sonic assault was the final, terrifying proof. The horror was complete, and the mass production phase was about to begin, ensuring that humanity would survive, albeit in a form unrecognizable and monstrous. Gray leaned back slightly, allowing himself a moment of grim intellectual satisfaction, the sterile observation room providing a necessary buffer against the sheer, overwhelming biological chaos unfolding 20 feet away. The subject's suffering was merely noise, a necessary byproduct of successful engineering, a persistent, high-amplitude alarm signaling constant, high-level energy expenditure, and slow, systemic self-poisoning. The FEV created resilience, but not immortality. It merely shifted the decay mechanism from external threats to internal consumption. P001 was a biological supernova, brilliant and powerful, but destined for a rapid, explosive collapse if not managed perfectly. It was the epitome of engineered desperation, a living testament to the fact that they had traded longevity for immediate, brutal survivability. The sheer metabolic rate required to sustain the creature's musculature and repair mechanisms meant that its internal systems were constantly drowning in endogenous toxins, lactic acid, urea, and complex waste nitrogen compounds that its kidneys and liver, though vastly enhanced, could never fully process. The creature was, fundamentally, operating at a perpetual redline, surviving only by sheer, forced biological momentum. The ethical lines had been crossed long ago, years before the creature was even conceived, when they chose to pursue the forced evolutionary virus as the only viable solution to the looming nuclear winter. Humanity, in its frail, soft, ethically burdened form, was obsolete. The super mutant was the necessary successor, a brutal, optimized organism designed to survive the harsh radiation, the resource scarcity, and the biological warfare that was surely coming. P001 was the prototype for a new species, born of scientific hubris and existential dread, a testament to the fact that survival, when stripped of morality, is an ugly, powerful thing. Gray watched the creature shudder, its massive chest heaving, the skin taut and sickly green-gray beneath the harsh laboratory lights, and felt only the cold validation of a perfect, terrible hypothesis confirmed. The creature charged a third time. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound of pure agony, both from the straining material and the creature's frustrated roar. The door frame warped visibly, the heavy locking bars groaning, inches from catastrophic, irreversible failure. The containment unit was failing rapidly, the structural integrity dropping below the critical 40% threshold. Gray gave the order, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony of alarms and structural stress warnings. Activate the sonic disruption array. Set frequency to 15 kilohertz, maximum amplitude. We need to stabilize the subject for immediate transport to the deeper isolation cells. Prepare the FEV strain for mass replication. We have sufficient data. The process is viable for wide-scale application and deployment. The air immediately filled with a high-pitched, agonizing sound, a targeted frequency designed to exploit the creature's slightly enhanced auditory sensitivity and overwhelm its nervous system. P001 clutched its massive, malformed head and roared, a sound now mixed with overwhelming neurological pain. The immediate effect was stunning. The creature recoiled, staggering backward, its immense strength momentarily nullified by the sheer sensory input. As the creature stumbled, Gray watched the screens with dispassionate intensity. A cellular division rate, though stabilized by the initial FEV introduction, showed a persistent, low-level error in genetic transcription. A minor, chronic instability manifesting primarily in the frontal lobe development and the long-term maintenance of complex neural pathways. This instability, though small, guaranteed variance in cognitive function, leading to varying degrees of intelligence degradation and physical mutation across future generations. This was the unavoidable imperfection inherent in their rushed, desperate evolution, a biological shortcut that sacrificed cognitive finesse for physical robustness. But it was a flaw they could live with. The primary goal of physical survival had been achieved. The data streamed across the monitors confirmed the chronic flaw was centered on the accelerated telomere erosion in non-somatic cells, meaning the creature's intelligence, derived from the pre-FEV baseline subject, would inevitably degrade over time, leading to the simplified, aggressive cognitive profiles they had predicted. The FEV granted strength and radiation resistance, but it was a blunt instrument, incapable of perfectly replicating the complex, fragile architecture of human consciousness while simultaneously turbocharging the physical form. The resulting organism was durable, terrifyingly strong, and increasingly simple-minded, a perfect, monstrous soldier, but a poor intellectual successor. Gray's gaze drifted from the vital signs heart rate, dropping slightly under the sonic assault, muscle contraction minimizing to the replication protocols displayed on the adjacent screen. Dr. Phillips, pale and shaking slightly near the console, confirmed the immediate steps. Replication protocols initiated, Doctor. We are moving to industrial-scale viral vector generation using the P001 strain. Estimated time to first viable mass patch, 12 hours. Containment hardening protocols are being applied to the deep storage units now. Excellent, Gray murmured, the sound of the sonic disruption vibrating through the soles of his shoes. The goal is dissemination before the strategic window closes. We must ensure the survival of the species, regardless of the cost to the individual mind or form. P001 is the proof of concept. The resulting population will be varied, yes, but they will live through the inevitable nuclear firestorm. He considered the implications of the cognitive degradation. They were not creating philosophers or engineers. They were creating survivors. The loss of complex thought was a small price to pay for the ability to resist lethal doses of gamma radiation and thrive on contaminated resources. The super mutants would be simple, yes, driven by basic needs and aggression, but they would be resilient. They would be the bedrock upon which a new, hardier civilization could eventually be built, even if that civilization was rooted in brutality and perpetual conflict. The thought was chilling, yet scientifically sound. The containment room smelled heavily of ozone and scorched metal, mixed with the acrid, metallic tang of the creature's sweat, byproduct of its hyper-accelerated ATP cycling. Technicians, clad in heavy hazmat suits, were already moving into position outside the reinforced glass observation window, preparing the heavy-duty tranquilizer darts necessary to complete the transfer. These darts contained a high-concentration neuromuscular blocker designed to temporarily paralyze the creature and allow the transport team to secure it in the specialized lead-lined transfer cell. Gray watched P001 slowly sink to its knees, the sonic waves overwhelming its nervous system. Its roars had degraded into whimpers of pure, unbearable agony. This was the moment of transition. The prototype phase was over. The data was conclusive. The horror was complete, and the mass production phase was about to begin, ensuring that humanity would survive, albeit in a form unrecognizable and monstrous. The scientific team, dedicated to the final, desperate act of species preservation, began the grim process of scaling up the biological catastrophe. The fate of the world was sealed, not merely by the impending nuclear exchange, but by the insidious, enduring biological legacy of of the forced evolutionary virus, ensuring that the post-war world would be populated by the products of their ultimate, horrifying scientific compromise. The creature, shuddering under the sonic assault, was the final, terrifying proof. The creation of the supermutant was the ultimate scientific achievement and the ultimate moral failure, inextricably linked by the single driving principle of survival at any cost. The command console flashed red, indicating the immediate commencement of FEV batch cultivation. Bioreactors across the complex, deep beneath the surface, were being primed with the necessary nutrient broth, viral cultures, and the stabilized genetic markers derived directly from P1's tissue samples. The process demanded secrecy and speed. They were racing against the clock of global annihilation. Every hour counted. Every liter of the viral solution represented dozens, perhaps hundreds, of future monstrous survivors. Gray felt a strange, cold pride. They had created a survival mechanism, and now they had to weaponize it and disseminate it before the bombs fell, sealing the fate of the world with a biological catastrophe far more complex and enduring than mere nuclear fire. He turned away from the suffering creature, his focus already shifted to logistics and deployment vectors. The initial batches would be prioritized for the military command structure and key scientific personnel, those deemed essential for rebuilding. The rest would be administered to the general population, selected for deep vault habitation, ensuring that the future inhabitants of the New World were robust enough to face the challenges of the Wasteland. The transformation would be brutal, painful, and often fatal in those with compromised immune systems. But those who survived would inherit the irradiated Earth. Dr. Phillips confirmed the viral yield projections for the first 72 hours. "We need a minimum of 5,000 viable doses," Gray instructed, his voice steady, "and ensure the containment field around P001 is immediately tripled once the paralysis takes effect. We cannot risk a breach during transport. This creature is too valuable and too dangerous to lose control of now." The high-pitched whine of the sonic array continued its relentless assault, a fitting soundtrack to the birth of a new, terrible age. The air filtration system struggled to cope with the increased heat and biological aerosols, circulating the stale, chemically charged air. Gray knew that even the air they breathed was now tainted by the success of their experiment, a silent, persistent reminder of the biological terror they had unleashed in the name of saving humanity from itself. The scientific data was perfect, the moral ledger irrevocably bankrupt, and the future of the world was now guaranteed to be violent, green, and terrifyingly strong. The command console flashed red, signaling the immediate commencement of FEV batch cultivation. Bioreactors were primed with nutrient broth, viral cultures, and stabilized genetic markers derived directly from P1's tissue samples. They were racing against global annihilation. Gray felt a strange, cold pride. They had created a survival mechanism, now weaponizing it for dissemination before the bombs fell. He viewed the FEV not as a weapon of mass destruction, but as the ultimate necessary act of environmental adaptation. Humanity, in its frail, irradiated form, was obsolete. The supermutant was the next inevitable iteration. This conviction hardened his resolve against the moral protests of his subordinates. Gray saw the FEV as a catalyst, purging the weaknesses inherent in Homo sapiens. He had spent decades studying humanity's self-destructive tendencies, the reliance on fragile technology, the petty wars, the biological vulnerability to radiation and disease. The supermutant state was a clean slate, a biologically perfect organism stripped of the flaws that led to this imminent global collapse. He believed he was saving the species by fundamentally changing what the species was. Gray turned away from the suffering creature. His focus already shifted to logistics and deployment vectors. The initial batches would be prioritized for the military command structure and key scientific personnel, those deemed essential for rebuilding. The rest would be administered to the general population selected for deep vault habitation, ensuring that the future inhabitants of the New World were robust enough to face the challenges of the Wasteland. The transformation would be brutal, painful, and often fatal, but those who survived would inherit the irradiated Earth. The FEV re-read the cellular structure, initiating rapid, uncontrolled mitosis, replacing vulnerable human tissue with dense, radiation-resistant biomass. It was a cruel biological lottery, weeding out the weak for the benefit of the strong. The list of those selected for the initial, prioritized inoculation was meticulously vetted, cross-referenced against psychological profiles and intellectual capacity metrics. Every name represented a life chosen for agonizing transformation. Yet Gray felt no remorse, only the cold calculus of necessity. The mortality rate during the initial mutation stage was projected to be high, perhaps 70%, but the survivors would be functionally immortal and impervious to the fallout. Dr. Phillips confirmed the viral yield projections for the first 72 hours. "We need a minimum of 5,000 viable doses," Gray instructed, his voice steady, "and ensure the containment field around P001 is immediately tripled once the paralysis takes effect. We cannot risk a breach during transport. This creature is too valuable and too dangerous to lose control of now." The high-pitched whine of the sonic array continued its relentless assault. Phillips, a nervous man, reported, "Yield rates are nominal, Doctor, but maintaining the structural integrity of the viral envelope at this scale is pushing the osmotic pressure regulators to their limit. We are using specialized adenoviral vectors, but the metabolic demand of the FEV replication cycle is stressing the broth composition. If we push the concentration higher, we risk destabilization and a 60% loss in viable material." The machinery thrummed, operating far past its red line, mirroring their desperate timeline. Phillips wrung his hands, the sweat visible on his brow despite the lab's controlled climate. "Doctor, the sheer volume of synthesized T-cell growth factors required is unprecedented. We are depleting our reserve stocks of the specialized nutrient precursors at an alarming rate. If the supply line fails, or if the purification centrifuges seize, the entire batch will crash, rendering the complex viral structures inert." The air was thick with the scent of stressed machinery and impending failure, a chemical signature of their desperation. Gray slammed his hand onto the stainless steel console. "We don't have time for nominal, Phillips. We have less than 48 hours until the predicted exchange window closes. Increase the nutrient infusion rate by 15% and initiate the cryostabilization protocol immediately upon harvest. We accept a 20% loss if it means hitting the 5,000 dose minimum." The viability of the species outweighs the efficiency of the lab. The laboratory pulsed with emergency activity, smelling strongly of ozone and accelerated biological growth. Gray walked toward the reinforced observation window overlooking P1's chamber. The creature, a towering monument to genetic manipulation, was finally succumbing to the sonic damping field. Its massive, newly formed muscles twitched involuntarily, the thick, ridged green skin shimmering faintly as the paralysis took hold. The triple containment field was a necessity born of terrifying experience. The primary layer was the sonic array, designed to disrupt motor control. The secondary layer was a high-amperage magnetic field intended to interfere with any residual bioelectrical signals the FEV might be generating. The final physical layer comprised titanium restraints, thick as a man's torso, clamping the limbs and neck. P001 was a biological siege engine. The magnetic field hummed, creating a faint, metallic taste in the air, and the restraints groaned under the creature's sheer mass. The effort to subdue P001 had already cost 3 lives and $500,000 in structural damage. The creature, once a man named Richard Gray, was now merely a biological engine of pure, adaptive rage. Its respiratory rate had dropped precipitously under the sonic assault, the huge chest rising and falling only shallowly. Monitoring screens displayed erratic, spiking readings in the creature's muscle fiber density, confirming the FEV's continuous, low-level activity, even under duress. "Scan the neural pathways again," Gray ordered, watching the creature's distorted face. The eyes, now small and deep-set, were rolled back into the sockets. "I want to confirm complete cortical shutdown before we move it to the cold storage containment unit. If even a fraction of its higher cognitive function remains, the risk of adaptive resistance during transport is too high." The FEV was designed for brute survival, prioritizing strength and resistance, resulting in the degradation of complex neurological structures. Endurance was the currency of the future. He turned his attention back to the deployment plans. The distribution network was the most vulnerable point, utilizing specialized, armored Vault-Tec transports covertly modified to carry biological agents. Phase 1 deployment, Operation Chimera, Gray murmured, tapping the glowing map. The priority targets are the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, Raven Rock, and the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. The command structure must survive, and it must survive strong. Securing these centers was paramount. They needed functioning infrastructure and a robust military backbone to coordinate the post-exchange world. The FEV, delivered directly to the deepest bunkers, would ensure that the future leaders were not only protected from radiation, but biologically optimized for command in a hostile environment. Dr. Phillips approached cautiously. "Doctor, the political liaison team is reporting severe resistance from the Vault-Tec Oversight Committee regarding mandatory inoculation. They are citing the Nuremberg protocols and demanding full disclosure of the neurological side effects." The controversy was intensifying, creating bureaucratic friction that threatened to derail their tightly controlled timeline. The public disclosure forms for Vault entry were being scrutinized by external legal teams who suspected the advanced prophylactic was something far more radical. Gray laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Nuremberg protocols? Phillips, the world is ending. Ethics died the moment the first thermonuclear warhead was armed. Tell the liaison team that the FEV is a highly advanced, bioengineered prophylactic against acute radiation poisoning. Assure them that the mild, temporary side effects, the increased musculature and altered skin pigmentation, are negligible compared to the alternative. We are saving them, whether they understand the cost or not." He knew that the lie was necessary to maintain the fragile illusion of control, allowing the deployment to proceed without armed intervention from the very military they intended to inoculate. Gray knew the true cost. The transformation into a super mutant annihilated the old self, replacing it with a massive, aggressive, sterile organism driven by primal urges. The sterilization was the final, brutal compromise, trading reproductive capacity for immediate, brute endurance. This was the ultimate irony. Survival at the expense of posterity. The species would live, but it would not reproduce. Its existence would be a perpetual, sterile struggle against the elements. "What about the general population vaults?" Gray pressed. "We need genetic diversity, but also robustness. Which geographical sectors are receiving the highest priority?" "We have selected 300 standard vaults based on optimal geographical dispersal, focusing heavily on the Midwest and Northeast sectors, where the predicted fallout density is highest," Phillips replied. "The inoculation will be disguised as the standard pre-sealing vaccination regimen. Vault-Tec personnel have been given modified instructions. They believe they are administering an advanced flu shot." The deception was multi-layered, ensuring that even the administrators of the inoculation remained ignorant of the biological time bomb they were injecting into the populace. A slow, sickening realization settled over Gray. He was authorizing the biological corruption of 300 separate societies, ensuring that when they finally opened their doors, they would unleash something new, terrifyingly resilient, and fundamentally broken. The FEV was a biological reset button. They were sacrificing culture and intellect for sheer, brutal survival. The future inhabitants would be strong enough to survive the nuclear winter, but perhaps too simple to ever rebuild true civilization. This was the dark bargain he had struck with fate, trading the complexity of humanity for its simple, brute persistence. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, knowing he was the last man making the last, terrible decision for the species. He stared at the countdown timer projected onto the main screen. 44 hours, 17 minutes, and 9 seconds. 44 hours until the predicted global exchange. Gray walked over to the secure storage unit where the first stabilized FEV doses were being loaded into cryogenic delivery vials. The liquid inside was viscous, faintly greenish-yellow, shimmering under the cold light. Each vial was labeled with a simple, chilling designation: Project Chimera Alpha. The sheer quantity of the material represented the end of the world as they knew it, and the beginning of something monstrous. Ensure the transport teams are fully briefed on the contamination risk protocol, Gray instructed. If a vial breaches containment, the area must be immediately sterilized with maximum thermal output. We cannot afford an uncontrolled outbreak here, not now. The military must believe this is the most critical asset for national survival. The risk of an accidental release in the densely populated scientific complex was terrifyingly high, requiring absolute adherence to the extreme sterilization protocols, which included localized thermite charges embedded in the transport vehicle chassis. He watched the technicians, encased in biohazard suits, handle the vials with trembling precision. Their fear was palpable. They knew they were handling the future, a future that demanded a price they could not yet comprehend. Gray felt nothing but a cold, clinical determination. He was the architect of the new world, where survival was predicated on monstrous strength. The fate of the world was sealed, not merely by the impending nuclear exchange, but by the insidious, enduring biological legacy of the forced evolutionary virus, ensuring that the post-war world would be populated by the products of their ultimate, horrifying scientific compromise. The transport teams moved with the heavy, measured cadence of men carrying priceless, volatile explosives. Each specialized cryogenic container, roughly the size of a small casket, held enough Project Chimera Alpha vials to inoculate 3 separate vault populations. The embedded thermite charges Phillips had ensured were linked to seismic and pressure sensors, guaranteeing immediate, localized incineration should the containment shell integrity drop below 99.8%. The military escort, composed of hardened strategic containment unit soldiers, understood the cargo was vital, but their briefing emphasized only the threat of exotic, highly contagious biological warfare agents, a necessary lie to maintain the operational security of the FEV. They were protecting the future of America, unknowingly protecting the transformation of humanity into something else entirely. Gray watched the last container descend the hydraulic ramp into the armored transport truck. The air in the loading bay was frigid, thick with the chemical scent of liquid nitrogen venting from the cooling units. The initial deployment phase is complete, Dr. Gray, Phillips reported. His voice filtered through the static of his communications headset. He looked utterly exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, but his posture remained rigidly professional. All 37 primary vectors are en route to their designated launch points. They will be integrated into the standard supply chains within the hour. The timing is critical. We must have the vials inside the vaults before the general population enters the final sealing procedures. And the efficacy rate? Gray asked, the question tasting like ash. He wasn't asking about survival, but about the ratio of successful mutation to catastrophic biological failure. Based on the genetic modeling of the pre-selected populations, those with the highest overall cellular resilience and lowest markers for rapid metabolic instability, we anticipate a successful, stable mutation rate of approximately 18 to 22%, Phillips stated, consulting a secure datapad. The numbers were delivered with the detached clarity of an actuary calculating risk premiums. The primary cohort of supermutants, those exhibiting maximized strength, increased intelligence, and stable regenerative capabilities, will be drawn from this group. We project one stable supermutant for every 5 inoculated subjects. Gray closed his eyes, visualizing the remaining 78%. The collateral? The remaining subjects will exhibit various degrees of transformation failure, Phillips continued, unperturbed. Approximately 40% will experience rapid cellular necrosis and death within the first 6 months of exposure, unable to process the aggressive viral restructuring. They are, essentially, non-viable biomass. Another significant percentage, perhaps 35%, will undergo accelerated cellular degradation without the corresponding muscular hypertrophy or cognitive stabilization. Their bodies will attempt to repair the damage caused by the FEV's initial assault, but without the necessary genetic markers for full mutation, they will enter a state of perpetual, agonizing decay. We anticipate these individuals will become the ghouls, the long-term, irradiated survivors whose immortality is bought at the cost of their physical and mental integrity. The cold mathematical certainty of the required suffering hit Gray with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just engineered the supermutant. They had, by necessity, engineered the ghoul, the living testament to the FEV's failure to achieve its perfect goal. The ghouls were the byproduct, the leakage, the horrifying evidence of their biological overreach, condemned to an eternal, irradiated half-life simply because their bodies were too resilient to die immediately, but too weak to fully evolve. They are necessary variables, Phillips rationalized, sensing Gray's distress. The instability of the ghouls serves a purpose, Doctor. They will act as a buffer, drawing initial post-war attention and ensuring the supermutant populations, our true investment, have time to consolidate their strength and resources within the sealed environments. Their persistence, though unintended, guarantees the long-term viability of Project Chimera Alpha. Gray could feel the stale, recirculated air of the bunker pressing against his skin, heavy and metallic, tasting faintly of ozone and impending destruction. His senses, once sharp and analytical, were beginning to dull, the world taking on a muted underwater quality. The bright, clinical lights of the laboratory now seemed jaundiced, casting sickly yellow shadows that danced with the frantic energy of the remaining personnel. He realized that the psychological defense mechanism he had employed, clinical detachment, was failing, replaced by a profound, pervasive dissociation. He was watching himself operate, a ghost directing the final acts of a tragedy. The microdosing protocol, Gray said, forcing his voice to remain steady, confirmed the delivery vector. The modified influenza vaccine utilizes a retroviral envelope, Doctor, Phillips explained, tapping the datapad. It ensures deep cellular penetration past the blood-brain barrier before the FEV payload is released. Standard immune response will register the injection as a benign, deactivated pathogen, allowing the FEV to integrate into the host genome undetected. This stealth vector is why the Vault-Tec personnel remain entirely ignorant of the true substance they are administering. The viral load is calibrated to activate only after a significant environmental stressor, specifically the massive influx of background radiation and the subsequent systemic shock of exposure to the post-exchange atmosphere. The vaults provide the perfect incubator, sealed environment, controlled nutrition, and then the trigger upon emergence. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly elegant design. The vaults, intended as sanctuaries, had been repurposed as biological staging grounds. The inhabitants were not survivors. They were unwitting subjects in a millennia-long experiment, their transformation delayed until the world outside was ready to receive them. 40 hours remained on the countdown clock. The distant, high-pitched whine of air raid sirens, usually tested on a low frequency, began to permeate the deep bedrock of the facility, no longer a drill, but a muffled, terrible certainty. The outside world was mobilizing, preparing for the inevitable final exchange of thermonuclear fire. Gray walked away from Phillips, moving through the subterranean corridors that had been his world for the last 5 years. He passed the sealed entrance to the primary reactor core, the thick steel doors vibrating slightly with the immense power contained within. He remembered the sunlight, the feel of real rain, the taste of fresh coffee. These memories were already fading, dissolving into the synthetic reality of the bunker, replaced by the constant, low-frequency hum of the life support systems and the sterile smell of powerful disinfectants. He reached the command center, a cavernous space where the remaining staff were huddled around holographic projections of global threat assessments. The maps were a kaleidoscope of red and orange, indicating high-probability strike zones. The atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Every movement was too quick, every voice too high-pitched. Status report on project. Chimera Beta, Gray commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the tense silence. A young woman, Dr. Anya Sharma, the lead geneticist for the secondary project, snapped to attention. Beta deployment is on schedule, Dr. Gray. The environmental dispersal units are being secured at the designated high-altitude launch platforms. We estimate full saturation of the North American target zones within T-minus 38 hours. Chimera Beta was the contingency plan, a highly aerosolized, less potent strain of FEV intended for rapid atmospheric dispersal. It wasn't designed to create supermutants, but rather to ensure that any surviving human population outside the vaults, those hiding in improvised shelters or remote areas, would be exposed, driving the general mutation rate across the entire species. It was the ultimate failsafe, guaranteeing that the FEV legacy would be inescapable, staining the very air they breathed. The airborne strain is designed for lower efficacy, yes? Gray pressed. It will primarily induce the ghoul condition, or simple cellular resilience. Correct, Doctor, Sharma confirmed, adjusting her glasses. Without the controlled environment and the specific genetic pre-screening of the vault populations, the airborne FEV will predominantly stabilize the host against radiation damage, preventing immediate necrosis, but it lacks the necessary stabilizing factors for full, intelligent mutation. It will create a baseline of hardy, long-lived survivors, the ghouls, but ensures that the species, as a whole, does not perish completely. It is the guarantee of biological persistence, even if that persistence is grotesque. Gray nodded slowly. The complexity of the horror was staggering. They had not merely planned for survival. They had dictated the precise type of survival for every single person who might draw a breath after the bombs fell. The vault dwellers would become the monstrous, powerful inheritors. The surface survivors, the eternal, decaying witnesses. The main screen flashed red, indicating a critical alert. The countdown timer shifted, the hours ticking down faster, reflecting the accelerated pace of global geopolitical collapse. 39 hours, 55 minutes, and 12 seconds. Dr. Gray, Phillips' voice crackled over the internal comms. The President has just authorized the final activation sequence for all strategic deterrents. This is not a drill. We have approximately 40 minutes before the predicted launch window opens. Gray felt a cold pressure building behind his eyes. 40 minutes until the world ended. 40 minutes until the FEV became the dominant biological imperative. He looked at the faces around him, fearful, dedicated, utterly ruined by the knowledge they possessed. They were the last scientists of the old world, the midwives of the new, grotesque age. He was the one who signed the orders, who authorized the suffering, who traded the soul of humanity for its indestructible shell. He walked towards the main ceiling corridor, the heavy steel door waiting to swallow them whole, severing them forever from the world they had just condemned. The smell of burning insulation and pressurized air filled his nostrils, the final suffocating scent of civilization's end. The cold pressure behind Gray's eyes intensified, a physical manifestation of the moral debt he was accruing, a debt that could only be paid by the extinction of the world he knew. He moved with leaden certainty towards the main ceiling corridor. Ahead, the heavy steel door R50, a 10-meter slab of reinforced osmium alloy, waited to sever them forever from the world they had condemned. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning insulation and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The high-pitched, insistent whine of the Level 1 alert system pulsed through the concrete, drowning out any whisper of doubt. The floor began to transmit a deep, resonant vibration. R50 lockdown initiated, a synthesized voice boomed, followed by the deep, shuddering groan of massive hydraulic rams engaging deep within the bedrock. The sound was primal, like the earth itself, sighing under unbearable pressure. All personnel must clear the primary threshold. T-minus 5 minutes to full atmospheric seal. Repeat. 5 minutes to complete planetary separation. Sharma and Phillips followed Gray, their movements sluggish, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion. They were performing a final, grim procession, dictated not by choice, but by the cold, immutable logic of the procedures they had written. They carried the full weight of the FEE project, the ultimate biological failsafe designed to ensure that even if the bombs fell, life, a twisted, agonizing form of life, would persist. Gray stopped just inside the safe zone, turning back to watch the monstrous door begin its slow descent. Confirming Chimera Beta deployment status, he demanded, his voice strained against the rising cacophony of the internal defense systems. Sharma quickly accessed her terminal. Telemetry confirmed successful deployment across all 42 designated high-altitude launch platforms. Initial aerosolization sequence complete. We are detecting saturation plumes over the North American Central Plains and extending deeply into the heavily populated Eastern Corridor. Dispersal rate is nominal, exceeding 98% efficiency in target zones. Nominal. The word masked a horror of unimaginable scale. Billions of people were now breathing the airborne plague. The Chimera Beta strain, engineered for deep alveolar penetration, would not kill them outright. Instead, it would initiate the slow, agonizing biological stabilization process that led inexorably to the ghoul condition, a perpetual, painful existence characterized by a cessation of natural aging, paired with catastrophic dermal and neurological failure. They had traded mortality for eternal, miserable suffering. Phillips, overseeing the environmentals, reported, his voice tight, engaging multi-stage air filtration array. Plasma sterilization cycles initiated. Once the primary seal is achieved, the facility will transition to a sustained negative internal pressure state to prevent inward migration of surface contaminants. Airlock integrity checks are green. The atmosphere inside the facility is now fully isolated. The R50 door closed with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate compression, a sound that signified absolute, irreversible finality. The vibration intensified, and the ambient temperature dropped sharply as massive liquid nitrogen heat sinks prepared the facility for deep isolation. Dr. Gray, the final telemetry packages are coming in from the surface monitoring stations, Sharma said, her voice barely a whisper. Initial biological analysis is disturbing. The aerosol is performing exactly as designed. We are seeing immediate cellular stabilization in test subjects, a rapid, exponential increase in telomere longevity, coupled instantaneously with severe epidermal breakdown and neurological degradation. The ghoul process is instantaneous at the cellular level. There is no latency period for the initial biological cascade. Gray closed his eyes, the sterile green light pressing against his eyelids, picturing the millions across the surface world, their internal clocks resetting to an eternal miserable zero. And the geopolitical status? Gray asked, forcing his focus back to the immediate threat. The window is opening, Phillips stated flatly, pointing to the main screen, displaying chaotic trajectory lines. Massive launch signatures detected originating from the Sino-Soviet territories and the Atlantic Command. Retaliation is confirmed. The exchange is fully underway. Estimated time to first impact in the immediate vicinity is 30 seconds. The facility, built deep beneath the bedrock, suddenly lurched. It was a violent, sickening, shuddering impact that felt less like an earthquake and more like a colossal fist slamming into the earth directly above them. Dust rained down. The inertial dampeners struggled wildly, groaning under the strain of the first near-field detonations. The lights flickered and died completely for a terrifying second, plunging the corridor into the sickly, unreliable green glow of emergency tritium lamps. Magnitude estimate? Gray yelled over the din. Unquantifiable, Phillips shouted back. Multiple high-yield tactical devices, likely in the 20 megaton range, detonating at or near ground zero across the eastern seaboard and the Pacific Rim. The ground is literally boiling above us. The integrity of the outer shell is holding, but internal stress fractures are mounting rapidly. Sharma, clinging desperately to the wall, pulled up a final chilling piece of data. Doctor, one of the high-altitude dispersal platforms, Platform 7, designated for the Pacific Northwest Dispersal Zone, was caught directly in the thermal plume of a strategic warhead. It was vaporized in the initial fireball. Gray stared at her. We confirmed the explosive vaporization of the remaining Chimera Beta payload? Confirmed, Sharma clarified, her voice shaking with the realization of the unintended consequence. The aerosolized FEV, instead of being dispersed slowly, has been driven into the stratospheric jet stream at extreme velocity and altitude by the force of a nuclear explosion. The physics of the updraft and the thermal injection have effectively weaponized the remnants. Meaning? Gray demanded. Meaning the FEV is no longer contained to the continental target zones we designated, Sharma clarified, looking utterly defeated. The strain is now globally dispersed. It will circle the planet within the week, carried by the high-velocity winds that sweep the upper atmosphere. Every surviving corner of the Earth, every remote island, they will all breathe the Chimera Beta. The biological failsafe is now universal and absolute. The FEV legacy was no longer a regional project. It was the mandated, global biological blueprint for all post-war life. The R-50 door finally clicked into its final position, and a series of massive pneumatic locks slammed home with deafening force. The synthesized voice confirmed, its tone triumphant. R-50 protocol achieved. Atmospheric seal complete. Facility transition to long-term isolation mode successful. The intense seismic activity continued for another 15 minutes, slowly subsiding into deep, irregular rumbling. 40 minutes had passed since the first alert. The old world was dead, extinguished not by the bonds alone, but by the biological certainty they had ensured. Move to the central command hub, Gray ordered, his voice hollow and flat. He adjusted his reinforced collar. We must monitor the initial FEVA exposure in the test vaults. The super mutant program begins now. We have guaranteed biological persistence for the species, but we must ensure the intelligence quotient of the inheritors. We cannot allow the future to be ruled by decaying, mindless shells. As they walked deeper into the facility, away from the sealed threshold, the air became eerily still, the only sound the rhythmic, powerful hum of the massive life support systems. Gray felt the cold certainty of his decision hardening within him. He had traded the soul of humanity for its indestructible shell, and now he had to manage the monstrous result. Their work had only just begun in the sterile, suffocating confines of their subterranean tomb. The descent into the subterranean heart of R50 was a passage through psychological purgatory. The polished chrome of the corridors reflected the emergency amber lighting, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with the ghosts of the billions just incinerated on the surface. Sharma walked 3 paces behind Gray, the silence between them thicker and heavier than the concrete shielding above. Every step resonated with the knowledge of their failure. a hollow, echoing drumbeat in the deep earth. She could still taste the metallic tang of fear and ozone from the initial seismic shock, a residue of the world's final violent breath. The global dispersal of Chimera Beta was not merely a scientific error. It was a cosmic joke played on the species they had intended to save, an act of biological imperialism executed by the very forces intended to destroy them. Gray, however, seemed carved from granite, his focus already shifted entirely to the next phase of the project. He was no longer reacting to failure. He was engineering success from the ashes of catastrophe. He had always viewed the human soul as a weakness, a fragile biological component prone to decay and moral compromise. For him, sentiment was a variable that had to be eliminated for true evolutionary progress. Now, only the physical structure mattered, the indestructible, resilient shell he had worked decades to forge. The containment breach of Platform 7 was a statistical anomaly that became a biological certainty, Gray stated, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile corridor. The FEV is no longer a localized experiment. It is the universal precondition for survival. We have guaranteed that life, in some form, will persist. Now we must address the quality of that persistence. They reached the central command hub, a vast circular chamber dominated by a holographic projection table and banks of humming monitors displaying complex biological and environmental data streams. The air here was artificially chilled, the atmosphere pressurized and filtered, lending the space a tomb-like stillness. The low thrum of the life support was the only constant sound in this subterranean sanctuary. Gray settled into the primary chair, the leather squeaking in protest under his weight. Bring up the FEVA exposure metrics for the initial control groups. Focus specifically on the high-stress cohort groups 7, 12, and 15. Sharma's fingers flew across the console, her movements precise and practiced, masking the tremor in her hands. 3 large screens flickered to life, showing grainy, infrared feeds from separate, heavily reinforced cells deep within the facility's experimental wing, the area designated for immediate post-war observation. The subjects volunteers, or perhaps conscripted personnel from the facility's lower tiers, their identities now redacted into alphanumeric designations, were visible, writhing in various stages of distress. The air in the cells was thick with the administered aerosolized virus, the FEVA strain optimized for rapid, comprehensive cellular reorganization. The biological response was immediate and violent. The initial data scrolled rapidly across the secondary monitors. Accelerated cellular mitosis registered at 1,500% above baseline, rapid bone density increase, and the telltale greening of skin pigmentation resulting from the viral alteration of melanin production. The growth rate was exponential, forcing the subjects' bodies to tear muscle fiber and split seams of skin as they ballooned in size, their forms shifting from recognizable human silhouettes to grotesque, hulking masses. The infrared captured not just the heat of transformation, but the sheer, agonizing speed of the mutation, accompanied by wet, tearing sounds muted by the thick walls. On Monitor 1, Subject 7A, formerly a mid-level technician named Miller, convulsed one last time before his skeletal structure stabilized. He was now nearly 3 meters tall, his shoulders impossibly broad, his skull thickening into a heavy, sloping brow. His uniform was shredded debris around his feet. The physical success was undeniable. Vascular stabilization achieved, Sharma reported, her voice strictly clinical despite the horror unfolding on screen. Mass increase, 280%. Estimated muscle tensile strength exceeds standard human limits by a factor of 6. Resilience metrics spiking across the board. They are immune to virtually all conventional biological agents and show remarkable resistance to low-level radiation exposure. The FEVA strain is performing exactly as designed regarding physical durability. Gray leaned forward, his reflection in the dark screen momentarily distorted by the subject's twitching form. Now, the critical metric. The reason we chose the FEVA strain over the more resilient but slower FEVB, cognitive function assessment, run the standard pattern recognition suite, followed by the complex problem-solving matrix. The system projected simple shapes, a circle, a square, a triangle onto the cell wall in sequence, requiring the subject to press corresponding buttons. Subject 7A stared blankly at the screen, his massive, newly formed eyes unfocused. He then let out a guttural roar, smashing his fist into the reinforced concrete wall, narrowly missing the projection surface. The sheer force of the impact shook the camera feed slightly. After 5 minutes, the system registered 0 successful responses. IQ degradation is severe, Doctor, Sharma confirmed, her voice laced with dread. The data was irrefutable. Pre-exposure baseline was 118. Current estimated function is below 40. The viral reorganization has prioritized physical resilience at the expense of cortical capacity. They are powerful, Doctor, but they are mindless, violent shells. They retain only vestigial memories and base aggression. Gray gripped the armrest of his chair, the sound of the plastic groaning under the pressure. This was the catastrophic flaw he had feared. The Chimera beta strain, now globally dispersed, guaranteed physical persistence, but the Phi-A strain, designed for rapid field deployment in the test vaults, was too crude for complex thought retention. The inherent violence of the transformation stripped away the intellect. Unacceptable, Gray hissed, slamming his hand lightly on the console. We need the intellectual inheritors of the Earth, not just the brute force guardians. A world ruled by beasts is no better than a world ruled by ash. We cannot allow the future to be governed by impulse and rage. His voice was low, but carried the weight of absolute, terrible authority. He stared at the giant creature pacing its cell, a monster born of hubris and desperation, a green testament to his ethical transgression. We must refine the process immediately, Gray commanded, his eyes fixed on the blank, aggressive face of Subject 7A. We will call them super mutants. They are the first generation, the foundation of the new species, but they are flawed. We need to identify the genetic markers that resist the cognitive degradation induced by the rapid mitosis. We must find the key to preserving the human mind within the indestructible Phi shell. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the banks of monitors displaying similar, terrifying results from groups 12 and 15. The world outside is now a biological soup, inoculated against extinction by our actions. Our work shifts from survival to selection. We will begin the long-term monitoring protocol. Every surviving brain, every captured subject, every potential anomaly will be analyzed. We will ensure the next generation is smarter, even if we have to process the decaying remnants of the surface population to isolate the necessary genetic resilience. The fate of the future was sealed in that sterile chamber. A world ruled by green, powerful and deeply, terribly lonely intellects, or perhaps just the terrifying, simple rage of the first batch. The long night of refinement had begun.